Welcome everybody to our second virtual Wednesday lecture. Mark Roberts will speak in a moment. He needs very little introduction to the British Institute community because Mark has been programming the Wednesday lectures for I think 30 odd years, as well as delivering a number of excellent lectures over the years himself. He's a fine speaker. So Mark, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you everybody for logging on. This talk is called Early Anglo-Florentines and Some 18th Century Visitors to Florence. The first Anglo-Florentine, that is to say the first Englishman we know of to have had an extended connection with the city, was John Gore, who was born around 1320 at Sybil Headingham in Essex. He came to Italy in 1363, and the following year was elected Captain General of the White Company, a frightening band of mercenaries who polished their weapons and armor with marrow extracted from the broken legs of goats. He became famous for the astonishing rapidity of his movements and for his murderous efficiency. In 1392, he was made an honorary citizen of Florence, having been Captain General of the Florentine troops since 1378. They couldn't pronounce his name, so they called him Giovanni Acuto, or John Sharp.
I hear something.
After his death in 1394, his body was given a magnificent torchlit state funeral and sent back to Essex at the personal request of King Richard II. Paolo Uccello's equestrian portrait of him in the left aisle of the Florentine Duomo shows his horse walking with both right legs advanced. A real horse never does. In later centuries, there were a great many English visitors to Florence, many of whom recorded their impressions of the city in fascinating detail. But not many of these settled here to the extent that we can call them Anglo-Florentines. Nevertheless, visitors are part of the English presence in the city, especially if they were writers and had interesting things to say about it. May I ask you please to mute your own microphones? Thank you.
Please mute, we can hear you. Please mute.
Humanist scholar John Collier.
Sorry to interrupt, Simon. If you click participants, the host click participants. There are 100 people who don't understand this. If they click participants and then click mute all, and then this problem will be resolved.
Yeah, but then I'll be muted.
Yeah, the trouble is it will mute Mark as well. So we just have to ask people to mute themselves.
Yeah, my partner, Joanna.
The humanist scholar John Collier, 1467 to 1519, arrived with both his parents, his father was Lord Mayor of London, in 1493, and stayed for 3 years, meeting many local worthies, such as Pico della Mirandola, Poliziano, Ficino, Savonarola. Then from 1496 onwards, he lectured in Oxford most successfully on St. Paul's epistles, following the new humanist methods that he had learned here in Florence. Collier later became Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London and a great friend of the Dutch scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, who said of him, "When I listen to Collier, I seem to be listening to Plato himself." My picture shows a generic humanist scholar. Robert Dudley, 1574 to 1649, arrived in 1605 with his beautiful mistress and cousin, Elizabeth Southall, disguised as a page. Elizabeth gave birth to 2 children called Maria and Cosimo, and then Robert bought from the Rucellai family a house on the corner of Via della Spada and Via della Vigna Nuova converting it into a lovely palazzo of his own design. 8 more children were born there. Robert helped the Grand Duke Ferdinando I to develop the port of Livorno, for which he was paid an annuity of 2,000 ducats, and he drained the marshes between Livorno and Pisa. He is a comparatively rare example of a completely integrated Tuscan foreign resident, someone who fully interacted with his adopted surroundings. As we all know, there are many degrees of assimilation. Another 17th century example of a temporary English resident is the scholar and diarist John Evelyn, 1620 to 1706, who arrived in October 1644 and stayed for a while with someone called Baritiere in Piazza Santo Spirito. He recorded his impressions of Florence in his famous diary. He preferred the Ponte Santa Trinita to the Ponte Vecchio. He liked Boboli very much and noted that the garden has every variety: hills, dales, rocks, groves, aviaries, vivaries, fountains, especially one of 5 jettos, the middle basin being one of the longest stones I ever saw. He was most interested to see that the Grand Duke sold his own wine and that there were wicker bottles serving as a vintner's brush over the door of Palazzo Pitti. He liked the Tribuna of the Uffizi and the Loggia dei Lanzi, where the Rape of the Sabines by Giambologna was his favorite sculpture.
No,
He
you have
wrote,
to salmon
at the
tonight.
Duke's Cavallerizza, the prince has a stable of the finest horses of all countries:
I just
Arabs, Turks, Barbs, Genets, English, etc., which are continually exercised in the manege. Near this is a place where are kept several wild beasts, as wolves, cats, bears, tigers, and lions. This would have been the zoo after which Via dei Serragli is named. They are loose in the deep walled court, and therefore to be seen with more pleasure than those at the Tower of London in their grates. One of the lions leapt to a surprising height to catch a joint of mutton, which I caused to be hung down. Here he is, posing with a skull beneath a Greek inscription in a fine portrait painted by Robert Walker in 1649. While he was in Florence, Evelyn commissioned this lovely cabinet, which he kept in his London house for many years. It is now in the Victoria and Albert Museum. After Evelyn's death, his celebrated diary was found inside an ebony cabinet, quite possibly this one. I especially like the little songbirds on the Pietrodura panels, which are by Domenico Benotti. Ignatius Hugford, 1703 to 1778, was born in Pisa to English parents who had settled in Tuscany.
Who's that?
His father was a Catholic exile from England who had been appointed watchmaker to the Grand Duke in Florence. He studied art with Domenico Gabbiani and became a painter, though not a very good one, specializing in religious pictures in the manner of his master Gabbiani. There's a roundel in the Church of Santa Trinita by him, for instance, and there's this one in the Church of San Francesco di Paola. Hugford is more important as a dealer and a collector than as an artist, for he had a pioneering interest in Florentine primitives and in early painting in general. The very beautiful picture by Hans Memling of the Madonna and Child with 2 angels, painted around 1480 and now in 1860, came from his collection. Ignatius edited Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Artists. He was definitely unusual in his appreciation of the primitives. Most grand tourists were far more interested in the 17th century painters. Ignatius had an elder brother called Henry, who was a monk at Vallombrosa. Henry eventually became abbot and gave Ignatius plenty of commissions.
I got the 9-4. Oh,
This Henry, or Enrico, specialized in scagliola, the much cheaper version of Florentine inlaid pietratura work. Scagliola is a technique to imitate marble or inlay, involving finely powdered selenite that is mixed with glue and pigment, applied like paint, and then fired in a kiln. Ignatius himself spent nearly his whole life in Florence and lived in Via de' Bardi, where he entertained many of the visiting English. In these two respects, he resembles the Horace Mann. Horace Mann, 1706 to 1780, can be regarded as the principal 18th century Anglo-Florentine.
I think I figured that out.
He was a little over 30 when he was sent to be assistant to the British resident Charles Fane in 1737. The Honourable Charles Fane was a very vain and lazy person and rather highly strung, and was said to have once taken to his bed for 6 weeks after the Duke of Newcastle, in one of his letters, forgot to sign himself "your very humble servant," as usual, and then he put "your humble servant." Horace Mann, on the other hand, was universally admired for his perfect manners and accommodating nature.
Wash the napkins.
The poet Thomas Gray called him the best and most obliging person in the world. In 1738, Horace Mann became chargé d'affaires and 2 years later was appointed resident minister. He stayed for over 40 years, becoming increasingly Italian in his manners.
He stayed for over 40 years.
Mann lived at Casa Maneki on the south side of Via Santo Spirito, on the corner of Via Mafia. There he entertained a constant stream of English visitors, putting some of them up in Casa Maneki or in the nearby Casa Ambrogi. He allowed his English spongers to sit all morning in his house reading the newspapers, and he entertained most lavishly. Horace Mann corresponded a good deal with Horace Walpole, the son of the Prime Minister, Sir Robert, who had helped him to get the job. Horace Walpole had arrived in Florence in 1739, aged 22, together with the future poet Thomas Gray on their grand tour. Walpole is on the left and Gray on the right. They spent their mornings exploring the churches, the streets, and especially the paintings assembled in Palazzo Pitti and the wonderful collection of sculptures in the famous gallery, i.e. the Uffizi. Before this, neither of them had seen much classical sculpture. Gray had never seen the Arundelian collection at Oxford, for example, and he had probably not seen Sir Robert's collection of Italian paintings at Horton. In Florence, Gray studied the art in considerable detail and filled copious notebooks. As we might expect, he completely ignored the primitives and the art of the 15th century. He quite liked Raphael, Giorgione, Veronese, and Titian, but he reserved his warmest praise for 17th century painters such as Annibale Carracci, Domenichino, Guercino, Salvatore Rosa, and above all, Guido Reni. Horace Walpole could not be bothered with Gray's note-taking. He too spent long hours in the gallery, though he was far more interested in society and was becoming weary of the splendors of the past. "I have seen several things that pleased me greatly," he wrote to his friend Richard West, "but I have left off screaming Lord this and Lord that. To speak sincerely, Calais surprised me more than anything I have seen since. I recollect the joy I used to propose if I could but once see the Grand Duke's gallery. I now walk into it with as little emotion as I should into St. Paul's. In Florence, Walpole took a rather low view of his fellow countrymen, and late in January, he wrote, "The most remarkable thing I have observed since I came abroad is that there are no people so obviously mad as the English." But Horace was delighted by the carnival early in 1740. "I have done nothing but slip out of my domino into bed, and out of bed into my domino. The end of the carnival is frantic bacchanalian. All the morning one makes parties to the shops and coffee houses, and all the evening to the operas and balls. Then I have danced, good gods, how I have danced." When the blind Florentine Pope, Clement XII, died in February, Walpole and Gray immediately set out for Rome to enjoy the ceremonies of the conclave. However, the cardinals took far too long to elect Clement's successor, so the pair of them decided, after a visit to Naples, to come back to Florence. They settled into the Casa Ambroggi, from the window of which it was apparently possible to fish in the Arno. Mann lived there himself quite as much as in his official residence, which was the Casa Maneki, as I said, in Via Santo Spirito. Again, Mann was very agreeable. The climate was perfect. The summer days and nights drifted by in happy idleness. Florence, Gray told West, was an excellent place to employ all one's animal sensations in, but utterly contrary to one's rational powers. He was very happy to accept the style of life that Horace Walpole found so agreeable. "Here you shall get up at 12 o'clock, breakfast till 3, dine till 5, sleep till 6, drink cooling liquors till 8, go to the bridge at 10, sup till 2, and so sleep till 12 again." After he left Florence, Horace Walpole never saw Horace Mann again, though they continued to write to each other for over 4 decades, on a scale truly phenomenal, and, as Walpole remarked, not to be paralleled in the history of the post office. Walpole's brilliantly witty letters are among the finest in the English language, though unfortunately the same cannot be said for Mann's. Lord Dover, who published a selection of them in 1833, said they were voluminous but particularly devoid of interest, as they are written in a dry, heavy style and consist almost entirely of trifling details of forgotten Florentine society. Well, that is, of course, precisely why we like to read them. In 1779, Horace Mann was rewarded for his long diplomatic service with the Order of the Garter. The Grand Duke acted as King George III's proxy for the handing over of the insignia, and a lovely dinner was served in Casa Maneki to celebrate the event, followed by a performance of Handel's Alexander's Feast. In 1782, 4 years before his death, Mann was created Envoy Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary. Horace Mann, together with many other English residents of the time, such as Thomas Patch and Lord Cooper, is portrayed by the painter Zoffany in a celebrated picture of the Tribuna at the Uffizi. This painting, which is now in the Royal Collections, was commissioned by King George III and Queen Charlotte because they wanted to have a record of the kinds of things that grand tourists went to see. They rightly supposed that as reigning monarchs, they would never be able to go on their own grand tour. And in any case, they hated traveling, especially the Queen, who had very nearly been shipwrecked on her way to England from Germany. Zoffany spent several years painting this picture with a generous annual salary from the royal family, and he rearranged all the paintings in the Tribuna in an extremely high-handed way. And in addition, he filled the foreground with portraits of his friends and acquaintances in Florence. It's a very striking and beautiful painting, emblematic of the Grand Tour. So it comes as a surprise to learn that it did not please the royal couple at all. They were furious with Zoffany for cluttering up his canvas with non-entities whom they'd never met and never heard of, and for not concentrating exclusively on the works of art, as he had been told to do. They banished the picture from their presence. One of the things that Horace Mann was supposed to do in his capacity as British minister was keep an eye on Bonnie Prince Charlie, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender, who since the failure of the Second Jacobite Rebellion and his disastrous defeat at Culloden in 1746 at the hands of the Duke of Cumberland, the Bloody Butcher, had embarked on his long alcohol-sodden exile. By this time, he didn't look nearly as glamorous as he had in his youth. In fact, as you can see here, he was rather seedy looking and usually drunk. In Florence, he settled with his solemn young bride into the Palazzo San Clemente, which is now the architectural faculty of the university. If you go in through the front door, you can still see the Royal Stuart arms painted on the wall opposite. But unfortunately, the iron weathercock with the letters CR for Carolus Rex would seem to have recently disappeared from the roof. Thomas Patch, 1725 to 1782, arrived hurriedly in 1755 from Rome, where he had been studying at the French Academy until he was involved in a homosexual scandal and set himself up in a few rooms in Via Santo Spirito, opposite the Casa Maneki. Grand Ducal Florence provided a more liberal atmosphere than did Papal Rome, or for that matter, than Protestant England. Patch was an early admirer of Masaccio and made 26 engravings of the Carmine frescoes, which were of some use to the restorers after the disastrous fire of 1771. His friendship with Horace Mann on the other side of Via Santo Spirito earned him many commissions from English tourists. Patch painted views of Florence and he made caricatures of all his friends in the 1760s. These caricatures are very striking, and if I close my eyes and imagine the English in 18th century Florence, I see them in the exaggerated forms that Patch gave them. This one is called the Punch Party, and it shows a group of English people in Florence being waited on by Charles Hatfield or Hadfield, a genial innkeeper from Manchester, shown bringing a bowl of steaming punch. Hadfield had a series of disasters when 4 of his children were murdered by a mentally deranged nurse. But one of his daughters did survive and grew up to be the painter and educationalist Maria Cosway, who once had an affair with Thomas Jefferson. I should have liked to have said more about women visitors, but really they are very thin on the ground in the 18th as opposed to the 19th century. One interesting example is Lady Craven, but I do not know enough about her to include her in this talk. Lord Cooper, 1738 to 1789, arrived under his courtesy title of Lord Fordwich in 1764 on his grand tour. The Italians couldn't pronounce Fordwich, so they called him Milord Forbici, or Lord Scissors. After succeeding to his father's title, he acquired the splendid Villa Palmieri and remained in Florence for 25 years. He was a great friend of Horace Mann and of the Grand Duke. Zoffany included him in his Tribune picture. He only visited England once, 3 years before his death, and apparently found it a disappointment. This is what often happens when people go back to England after many years of living in Florence. Lord Cooper was not only a collector, commissioning pictures, for example, from Anton Raphael Mengs, whom he met in Rome in 1762, but was also a patron of science. He was made a member of the Florentine Academy and of the Accademia della Crusca, and he also loved music, and he had his own private orchestra at Villa Palmieri, where in 1768, Handel's Alexander's Feast was performed. As we saw last week, from Zoffany, Lord Cooper bought Raphael's Niccolini Madonna, now in the National Gallery of Washington. In 1774, Cooper met the pretty 15-year-old Hannah Gore, who was in Florence with her parents, and fell in love with her. Here you can see the whole Gore family making music, while Lord Cooper particularly admires Hannah, who is about to burst into song. She is standing beneath a painting of the Temple of Hymen, the Hellenistic god of marriage and conjugal love. Cooper followed the Gore family to Rome and managed to marry her privately in Florence the following year. She bore him 3 sons, but the marriage soon became the focus of Anglo-Florentine gossip, one of the most poisonous in all Europe. Horace Mann no doubt sounded as though he was protesting too much when he insisted to the gossipy Horace Walpole that the Earl and Countess of Cooper live on the best terms together. Thomas Pelham noted the invidious and scandalous Florentines supposed Lady Cooper's intimacy at the palace to be criminal. And indeed, Cooper's appointment as Prince of the Holy Roman Empire in 1771 was widely regarded as compensation for his wife's liaison with the Grand Duke, Leopoldo I, brother of the Emperor Joseph II. "She is the most beautiful woman I ever saw," wrote Thomas Brand in 1784, but he added that she was proud and capricious, and almost all the travellers of this season are disgusted with her. I should perhaps say that in 18th century usage, the word disgusted was much milder than it is now. After her husband's death, Hannah stayed on in Italy, seeing a good deal of her sister Emily until her death in 1824. She lies buried in Livorno. Hester Thrale, 1741 to 1821, shown here with her daughter in a portrait by Joshua Reynolds, had been a great friend of the celebrated Dr. Samuel Johnson, but lost his friendship when she married Gabriella Proxy from Brescia in July 1784. The Piozzis at once set out for Florence. Dr. Johnson died while they were en route and settled into the so-called English house inside Palazzo Ricasoli in what is now Piazza Goldoni. There they set up a little academy, frequented by a not very good poet called Mary, by Mrs. Robinson, the actress, and by 3 writers called Adney, Parsons, and Greathead. Incidentally, the not very good poet was one of Lady Cooper's lovers. In Florence, Hester Piozzi wrote her Anecdotes of the late Samuel Johnson and contributed to a volume about the Academy called the Florence Miscellany, which was widely read in England. William Beckford, 1760 to 1844, arrived in September 1780 while working on his amusing spoof, Extraordinary Painters, and stayed on the north side of the river, on the Lungarno between the Ponte Vecchio and the Uffizi. It was Beckford who first said about Florence Cathedral, and his remark has been repeated many times, that the architect seems to have turned his building inside out. Nothing in art is more ornamental than the exterior, and few churches are so simple within. Beckford was immensely rich, having inherited a fortune founded on sugar production in the West Indies. His godfather was William Pitt the Elder. When he was 5, he was given music lessons by Mozart, who was 9. One of his letters has a good description of the Bobbly Gardens in the picturesque manner, and I'd like to read you some of it because it's an extraordinary example of a kind of travel writing that had enormous appeal at the time. The passage ends with an unflattering glimpse of Anglo-Florentine society. We're coming to the end now. What a serene sky! What mellowness in the tints of the mountains! A purple haze concealed the bases while their summits were invested with saffron light, discovering every white cot and every copse that clothed their declivities. The prospect widened as I ascended the terraces of the garden. After traversing many long alleys brown with impending foliage, I reached the opening on the brow of the hill and seated myself under the statue of Ceres. I surveyed the mosaic cupolas of the Duomo, its quaint turret, and one still more grotesque in its neighborhood, built not improbably in the style of ancient Etruria. Beyond this singular group of buildings, a plain stretches itself far and wide, scattered over with villas, gardens, and groves of pine and olive, quite to the feet of the mountains. After I had marked the sun's going down, I went through a plait of vines hanging on the steeps to a little eminence, round which the wood grows wilder and more luxuriant, and the cypresses shoot up to a surprising elevation. The pruners have spared their sylvan corner and suffered the bays to put forth their branches, and the ilex to dangle over the walks, many of whose entrances are nearly overgrown. Now comes Beckford's supercilious description of a visit to Lord Tilney's house near Piazza del Carmine. It was 6 o'clock, and all the world was going to my Lord Tilney's, who lives in a fine house all over blue and silver, with stuffed birds, alabaster cupids, and 1,000 prettinesses more. But, after all, neither he nor his abode are worth mentioning. I found a deal of slopping and sipping of tea going forward, and many dawdlers assembled. So, that was William Beckford, who lived to a great age and built as his own residence Fonthill Abbey, with a spire taller than that of Salisbury Cathedral, and lived to see it all collapse. With the outbreak of the Napoleonic Wars, English men and women were forbidden to travel abroad, and the age of the Grand Tour, as well as a chapter in the history of the Anglo-Florentine community, came to an abrupt conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. In a moment, we'll take questions.
Yeah.
Mark, if you put the, if you hide your screen, we'll be able to see each other. Just before we take questions, I want to just say 2 things. First of all, apologies for 1 or 2 of the technical glitches. We'll get better as we go along. I figured out how to mute people who hadn't muted themselves halfway through, and it improved. Second of all, thank you very much to everyone who has already donated. The donations have been coming in steadily, and it's much appreciated and frankly much needed. And as you know, half of what we gather we are sending across to Il Croce di Firenze, who are buying ventilators for the local hospitals. Third of all, third of all, this meeting was actually oversubscribed. There's 100 people in the room, and I think a few people couldn't get in. We will try and see if we can expand our capacity for next week so that everybody can be accommodated. And I will apologize to those who couldn't get in. That's a nice problem to have. And last notice is that next week, same time, same place, will be Jamie Boudreau's lecture. He's the head of history of art at the British Institute, looking closely at Piazza Santissimo Annunziata, both the architecture and the history and the art that's contained in that extraordinary corner of Florence. So that's enough from me. If you want to ask a question, I think you are able to unmute yourself. Is that true? Or do I have to do it for you? If you can't unmute, wave vigorously and I'll unmute you. Sarah, for example, can you unmute, Sarah? Is it possible?
Yeah, it's possible to.
Yes.
Okay, so questions and comments for Mark, from anybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would it be possible? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Would
Hi,
it be
Julia.
possible to think in terms of the continuation? Like the little girl, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, was taken by her parents to the battlefield of Waterloo immediately after that defeat. And that begins the next generation of the grand tourists,
Yes.
which also include women as well as men the second time round.
Yes. Thank you, Sword Julia. Indeed, I'm aware that there are many more female visitors in the 19th than in the 18th century. Even in the 18th century, there were a few. We had Mrs. Thrale, and I know a little about Lady Craven. I'm sure members of the audience will know of other English women who visited Florence in the 18th century. But certainly, as you say, after the Battle of Waterloo, the floodgates were open and Thomas Cook's tours started up and people started to pour into Florence, men as well as women.
Do you know anything about the Mrs. Chichester who had a hermitage in the Torrigiani garden?
And what period was that?
I don't know. The hermitage is there with a great plaque, and nobody seems to know anything about her. I've got a Chichester in the English cemetery, but even their descendants don't know anything about the other Chichester.
Interesting.
Who was in the sort of the garden hermit in the Torrigiani garden.
Yeah.
It's a mystery.
Interesting.
More questions?
Anybody else want to make a comment or ask a question?
Silence.
I have a question about the academy. You said that PLC family set up. What was it? What type of academy was it?
Well, it was I believe it was a literary academy.
Okay.
They used to meet in Palazzo Ricasoli, in a part of the palazzo that was known as the English House. And I know they had this connection with the Florentine Miscellany, which was a publication, and some of their writings appeared in that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question or a comment? Well, we still have some few remaining minutes of this meeting, I think.
Mark, I don't know if I can be heard.
Christine.
Yes. The picture of Hannah Gove made me think of the portrait of the couple on the wall of the director's flat.
Ah, yes.
And I would just love to know who those two people are.
Yes, I don't know. I think those pictures came through Harold Acton's family, but who they were, I don't know. I imagine they have some Florentine connection.
Well, it's a couple who are looking at the plans of a building.
Oh.
And if you look closely, and there are also some grotesques in the picture.
Oh.
But it would be really interesting to see if we could find out who those people were.
Yes, that's a project for somebody.
I'll have to ask Jeremy to find somebody who can do that for us, because when I'm in Florence, which I'm not at the moment, I enjoy that portrait very much.
So do I. Or did I mean.
Yes. For those who don't understand, Christine was the former director of the Institute some years ago.
I have a question, Mark.
Yes.
I'm wondering, have you come across the attitudes of visiting English Protestants towards Catholicism? Whether their grand tours would maybe confirm a negative view?
Absolutely, they usually took a very dim view of it, and very often the bear leader or the tutor was specially chosen for his robust Protestant attitude, and there were constant warnings given to the young gentlemen that they mustn't be seduced by the attractions of the Church of Rome. Hi. Hello.
Ciao, Mark. Hi, Mark.
Hello.
Ciao, Mark. Sono Barbara.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Barbara, ciao.
Come state?
Bene, noi molto bene, grazie.
Tutto a posto?
Sì, tutto a posto.
Cristina, come va? Bene?
Sì.
Sto bene anche in Francia.
Bene, mi fa piacere rivederti. Tutto a posto?
Piacere, Barbara.
Sì.
Grazie.
Mi mancate tanto. Mi fa piacere rivedervi. Tu.
Grazie.
Grazie.
Bravissimo, Mark, for opening up that window, please.
Ah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would only suggest that you open more windows.
Right. Yes.
As we're all inside trying to look out.
Yes. Yeah, no, I'd like to be able to open more windows.
Very good. Well, we're looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody.
Grazie tante, Mark. Grazie, Simon. Grazie per questa videoconferenza. Mi ha fatto proprio piacere. Grazie.
Prego, Barbara. Well, one of the things that we've done this week is we've actually made a recording of this Zoom conference with Mark's lecture. So we'll distribute that next week with the What's On message for those who weren't able to get in or the time was wrong. We had a number of requests from Australia if we could record, because the Australians, it's the middle of the night for them. And if this works, then we're thinking that when finally we get into phase 3 or 4 of the Rientra, when we can do live lectures at Palazzo Lamborghini again, if it's working well, we'll probably continue to Zoom the live lectures for those who are not in Florence, who would like to join in, and also record so we can put it up online. So out of this huge challenge of the lockdown, we're learning a whole new set of tricks, which I hope will be good going forward.
Good.
May I just ask one quick question, Mark?
Yes,
how would you define, what would you say would be the defining characteristic of an Anglo-Florentine with respect to just another grand tourist residing, maybe not permanently, and if it is just about the residence?
Well, yes, I think I mean, I don't know that this is a proper definition, but I think of Anglo-Florentine as connoting somebody who was settled here rather than just passing through. It's true that some of the grand tourists did stay for very long time periods.
Right. You know, especially in that period.
Yes, in the 17th and 18th century. I mean, John Evelyn was here for quite a long time. So was John Milton, whom I didn't mention. And another was Edward Gibbon, the historian, who stayed quite a long time in Florence. But he can't really be considered an Anglo-Florentine.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Simon, would it be all right to make the announcement about the Dante?
Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. We have formed a Cenacolo Dante Alighieri, and we were meeting every Thursday, and the last Thursday of the month we were meeting for dinner at the Trattoria Il Pennello, which is where Dante was born. But with the coronavirus, we had to go virtual. So every Thursday we intend to read 3 cantos. We haven't managed to do the Zoom because most of the Italian participants don't have that kind of technology. But we're still reading it, and there is a recording on the website. It's www.florin.ms, and that will immediately give you where to click for the Cenacolo Dante Alighieri. We're only as far now as Inferno 29, when we really should be in Purgatorio for Easter, and we're still in hell. But you're very, very welcome to be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia.
Any more?
Mark, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. It's Tanya Vartan.
Yes, Tanya, how nice to hear you.
Well, how nice to hear you. I loved your lecture, and I think you should give a new one very soon on the Anglo tourism after the 18th century, the 19th century, and the early 20th century. Yes.
Oh, yes. Well, the early 20th century I haven't done, but we did have a talk on the 19th century in January.
Oh, I missed it.
Well,
sorry.
Well, thank you.
Maybe
for the future, maybe we'll be able to have these recorded and put on the website, and I think that would be a great advance. And as Simon says, it's something positive that's come out of this beastly coronavirus.
Oh, yes, exactly. I should hope so.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it was grand watching you and listening to you. Be
Thank
well.
you. Thank you, Tanya.
Mark?
Yes.
Yes, this is Jonathan Mandelbaum from France.
Yes, Jonathan.
Yes, you may remember me from the lecture I gave on Lawrence of Arabia.
Yes, indeed.
Yes, and
Very
I'm so pleased to be with all of you. And
yes.
I have a very strong interest in Portugal, with many books on my shelf next to the desk.
Yes.
And I found an amusing reference to Horace Walpole.
Yes.
In the book by Rose Macaulay, They Went to Portugal.
They went to Portugal, yes.
Which covers, which deals with visitors to Portugal in much the same way as you did for visitors to Florence. And she has this sentence on Horace Walpole regarding Camoens and the Lusiads. Yes. And she says, Horace Walpole, whom epic bored, decided that he preferred Camoens to Virgil, Lucan, and Dante. Dante he found like a Methodist parson in Bedlam.
Well, he's very colourful, Horace Walpole.
Thank you very much for your lecture.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Pleasure. And I hope you're all well in La Mia Cara Firenze.
Yes.
And elsewhere.
Comparatively.
Yes.
Okay. Last orders. Any more thoughts or comments or questions or greetings before we start to wrap? If not, I encourage you all to watch out for the link for next week at 6 o'clock next Wednesday, Florence time, Jeremy Boudreau on Piazza Santissima Annunziata. And if you haven't already and you feel able to, the donations are very welcome, both for us and for Il Cuore di Firenze. So one more chance for anyone else who wants to say anything. In which case, I think it's down to me to thank Mark very much indeed for that wonderful talk, the latest in the series, for which he has become justly renowned. Many requests for further lectures I hear. Yes, well, goes around, mostly on mute, but we can see the action, which is great. Yeah, so we'll keep this going as long as lockdown and social distancing makes it impossible to run lectures in Lanfredini. And so stay with us, and I'll see if I can get a room for more than 100 people next week, since quite a few people couldn't get in. Okay, thanks everyone. Look after yourself, be safe, be well, keep happy, and alla prossima settimana. Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Ciao, thank you. Grazie.